Yes, so we will be talking about motion primitives. So I'm a senior researcher at the IDIAP Research Institute, and I'm also a lecturer at EPFL in Lausanne. So you are at IDIAP. So IDIAP is these different topics of research. So it's an institute specialized in machine learning and artificial intelligence. It started with speech processing mostly, then there was vision, and now there are all of these different fields related to machine learning, representing about 150 persons in this building. And we have connections with EPFL, so the PhD students are affiliated with EPFL, for example. So we have the role of doing research, doing education, and also technology transfer. So in the robot learning and interaction group that I am heading, we are mostly focusing on learning from demonstration. So how to transfer skills to robot so that the persons do not necessarily need to know a computer language but can show to the robot what they want the robot to do and have the robot extracting from these demonstrations what is important to replicate. So there are many underlying challenges. First, there are different modalities that we can use to collect these demonstrations. So when we learn from demonstration, maybe we think directly about vision, because it's true that the robot can look at what the person is doing and can collect data from the user performing the task. But there are also other techniques like kinesthetic teaching, where we grab the arm of the robot, show to the robot what to do, and while the robot is recording proprioceptive information about the task that we are demonstrating. There are also teleoperation mechanisms that can be used, where we teleoperate the robot, but we also record the teleoperation data that has been transferred to the robot. And there are many of these different modalities that we can use, and that should be orchestrated all together. So it's one first challenge. The second challenge is related to the correspondence problems, so generalization aspects. So if we demonstrate some task, we would like a robot to reproduce the task in new situations, and we would also potentially like to transfer the task from one robot to another robot with a different morphology, with different capabilities. So there are many actually generalization challenges underlying learning from demonstration. So in a nutshell, this is the kind of research aspects that we are interested in the group, and for this we need some representation of movements. So we need some representation of movements that is adaptive, that is robust. We can look at very different way of encoding movements. So we can look at it from a statistical point of view by recording several demonstrations and trying to extract relevant information from these demonstrations. We can look at it from a geometrical point of view by looking at the way these movements are related to geometrical aspects. And we can look at this from a dynamical perspective, by having dynamical systems encoding the movement itself. So, movement primitives are very important for different reasons. So, first for analyzing movements, so to extract what is the essence of the movement, to synthesize new movement data, so to generate trajectories that look similar to the one that have been recorded. There is also the edition aspect, how to edit movement. If you are interested in having a user interface so that we can create new movement primitives in a user-friendly way. And there is the skill transfer aspect. So here it's at the crossroad of analysis and synthesis, in the sense that we first need to understand what is the movement before adapting it to a new situation. For robotics, but it's a cross-disciplinary research domain. It also spans human movement science, sensory motor control, neurosciences, biomechanics, computer graphics, or sports sciences, and probably many others, because movement is actually everywhere. So this will be the outline of my presentation this morning. So first I will talk about the scalar superposition of basis functions. So I will look at different ways of organizing the movement as basis functions that are superposed in a scalar manner. I will talk about locally weighted regression, Gaussian mixture regression, dynamical movement primitives, and then probably after the coffee break, I will talk about a different weighting mechanism, how to superpose movement but as a fusion problem. So a more elaborated way of superposing these movement primitives. The difference between the first part and the second part is that in the first part it will be scalar weights, and in the second part it will be full weight matrices being used to compose the movement. And here I will be talking about how to use model predictive control for movement primitives, and maybe a bit about the way we can move these movement primitives toward other manifolds, such as encoding orientation. So I will start with this part, the superposition of basis functions with these different techniques. And I will start with maybe the earliest technique, the Bézier curves. So when I'm talking about superposing basis functions, what I mean is this, is that I will have some weight that will first be scalar weights, and I will have some basis function phi. And then I will superpose this basis function to build a movement. So if it's a 1D signal, this would be one possible way of representing this signal by having these basis functions here, that are in this case Bernstein basis functions. And then if I'm taking one of these functions and I multiply it by some weight, and I'm making plus this basis function multiplied by some weight, and so on, I can reconstruct my movement by this superposition. So here it means that I could represent that with 5 basis functions, and if I'm giving the basis functions, it means I need to find 5 scalar values to know what the superposition will be to represent my movement. And what we will be discussing this morning is the different basis functions that we can use to do that. So with locally weighted regression, we are talking about radial basis functions, like Gaussian-like functions that we will also superpose to build a movement. And we will also be talking about cosine basis functions and its relation to Fourier series, hereby superposing cosines of different frequency in order to build a movement. So I will try to stick to this notation, but sometimes in one field or another, some other notation are being used. So sometimes I will use a combination of both, but I will always try to relate to this equation here by using phi for the basis function and w for the weight.
Do you mix them? No.
It's possible to mix them.
In the same sum?
It's possible, yes. It's one of the, I would say, one of the new research aspects that so very few people are mixing them, but in practice, yes, and it's something that is actually, that makes sense, because for some movement you prefer these types of basis functions, for other movement, other types, and mixing them can build actually a dictionary that is maybe suitable for more diversity of movements. So of course, during the presentation, please feel free to stop me at any time. So please interrupt me either to say something again, or if you have a question. So we should make it as interactive as possible. So please raise your hand when you want me to stop, slow down, or come back to this slide. But yeah, I guess we'll come back to this question regarding the organization by combining these different basis functions. So I will start with Bézier curves. So this name is maybe well known. Like a lot of people know about Bézier curves, but maybe we tend to forget that there are actually other works related to Bézier curves, related to Sergei Bernstein and Paul de Castelgio. So Bézier curves are used in many applications. It has an interesting story behind it, because it was in the car manufacturing application that these things arose. It's something that is older because Bernstein polynomials are known from a very long time. But it's in the car manufacturing industry that Bezier curves have started to be used. So Pierre Bezier was the first to patent and popularize these techniques. He was working at Renault, but there were also work at Citroën, also regarding these curves, achieved by Paul de Casteljau. So the name sticks to Bezier, but there are many actually people behind these Bezier curves. It's used, as I said, in many different places. If you think of it as a way to edit trajectories, you can find this in softwares, many softwares, to edit curves, to edit keyframe, in timeline graphs. So it's very popular to edit movements, to do animations. It's also popular for fonts. TrueType fonts are using quadratic Bezier curves, and PostScript are using cubic Bezier curves. So it's really something that we can see at many different places. For edition, it's quite popular because it's allowing you to have a nice user interface. The weight in this mechanism can be represented visually. It corresponds to some key points that are representative of the curve. It's actually showing where the curve should pass through and also which direction it should have at this given point. So it's one of the reasons that it was widespread in this way, is that it's very intuitive to edit a movement with this Bezier curve. So let's see what is behind. So behind, we can think of the most simple Bezier curve that would be just a linear interpolation. So we can call it a linear Bezier curve. That would be just a line moving from P0 to P1. And if I'm taking a time signal going from 0 to 1, and if I'm moving this timeline, I will reconstruct a line moving from here to here. And this equation will be used in a recursive manner. You will see that next. So if you have this in mind, after we will do something very similar for the quadratic Bezier curve, but this time we will reuse the previous result, and we will say that we will have a linear combination of this function and this function. Here this is an animation showing what it does. Here you need to imagine that we have first a point moving in this direction. You can think of another point moving in this direction. And now if you can connect a line between these two, and you also move along this line, then you reconstruct some quadratic Bezier curve. So here it's one way to represent it. So in a recursive manner, we start from the linear Bezier curve, and then we build upon that to create a quadratic Bezier curve by having this linear interpolation with this basis function b, p0, p1, and b, p1, p2. Then we can look at what is the result of this if we are now expressing it in terms of these three key points, p0, p1, p2, and we would get this equation. Here it's another way of seeing what it does. So we have this 3 point, it will move from P0 to P2, and P1 will give the direction that we want for the first part of the movement and for the last part of the movement. And then with this we can extend this principle to higher order Bezier curve. So cubic Bezier curves, that are maybe the most used ones, are doing that, but with a higher order. So it's taking back the quadratic Bezier curve, and it's making a linear interpolation between the two. So now geometrically, it's becoming a bit more complex to visualize what is happening as a mechanical system. But as you can see, there is really this recursion between first that, then this, and then when it's cubic, adding one more layer of interpolation. So one useful way to make a connection between Bezier curve and the organization of movement as movement primitives is to look at what is the underlying basis functions in this system. So the underlying basis functions for cubic Bezier curves would look like this. It would mean that I'm superposing these different functions all together with different weights, and I'm building the movement by having a scalar weighting of these basis functions. So these are called Bernstein polynomials. One property is that if I'm summing all of these Bernstein polynomials, I get a constant signal. So if I'm summing all of this, it's giving me trajectory full with only one, so not moving. So now what happens is that we can generalize these equations. So instead of going one step after the other like that, we can directly write the end result for any Bezier curve of degree n. So it's usually written like this. And here we have the Bernstein polynomials appearing. So here we will have P representing the key points, and B the Bernstein polynomials. It's usually written like that. Here this notation means binomial coefficients. So here it's just a notation to say that this is something like that, with n factorial divided by I factorial multiplied by n minus I factorial. So these things will actually let us know what kind of value I need to put in front of these different P. So one way is to remember that, but another way is to rebuild this kind of equation. And the way to rebuild binomial coefficients, there are several ways, but one easy way is to start with something like that. It's a Pascal triangle, where we start with 1, and we put on this line 0 everywhere else. And what we do on the second line is to sum, as a tree, we sum each of the components, and we compute the sum of this. So here it's 0 plus 1 equal to 1. Here 0 plus 1 equal to 1. And then at the next line we do the same. And here a 2 appears, so 1 plus 1 equal 2. And then we can build a tree like that, and this will represent the binomial coefficients we are looking for. Another way to visualize this is to think of this as length. Here the length of a line, the surface of a square, the volume of a cube, or something higher order. And if you think of the decomposition of these things, if I'm taking a surface, I could divide my surface in different surfaces, and if I have one size of this square being a plus b, then I have this surface that can be decomposed in this way. And here I also have my binomial coefficients appearing here. So it's one way to visualize, otherwise the Pascal triangle is also doing exactly the same. So here, let me give you an example. So if I'm taking a spline of degree 4, a Bezier curve of degree 4, my coefficients here will be 1, 4, 6, 4, 1, multiplied by t at the power of 0, so it means 1, t at the power of 1, t at the power of 2, 3, and 4. Then here I will have 1 minus t at the power of 4, the power of 3, 2, 1, and then when it's at the power of 0, it's creating 1. If I'm taking the next line, I will have something like this. So with this equation, we can start creating movement primitives by using these bases by giving the degree as the polynomial order that we want to consider. It will create a given number of basis functions, and then I can try to represent a movement by using this mechanism. So here typically the goal in the learning aspect will be to understand how to weight these different basis functions to represent my movement. So typically I will give a dictionary phi k. And if I get demonstration x, I will try to figure out what is w. So here with this simple example, this would be the w that would fit the best this n-shaped curve. So maybe to summarize, Bezier curves are used everywhere, but very often we tend to forget that this can be represented as this kind of basis functions. And here in this lecture, we will after make the connection between this and other types of basis functions. So this is what I will do next. So here now, locally weighted regression. So locally weighted regression is this time radial basis function that looks like Gaussians, and that will be superposed to reconstruct the signal. The main tool to do locally weighted regression will be least squares. So least squares is really everywhere. Here it's weighted least square that will be used. But in this lecture you will see least squares really at many different places. So there are several ways, of course, of describing what is a least squares problem. Here I will take this notation. So I will consider first multivariate input and multivariate output. So I will make like some generalization of the typical one-dimensional output being described for least squares to multiple least squares problem. So it means that my input data will be described like that, where I would have n data points, so trajectory of n points, and the input would be di. My output would be do. And here the goal will be to find some A matrix, being di by do, to have this linear relationship between x and y. So as an optimization problem, it means I want to find A, minimizing this cost function. So here, I will use this notation. In matrix form, it will look like this. And then typically, this kind of problem, if I now want to find this A minimizing this, so I can differentiate with respect to A, equating it to 0, and find what is my A. So here I will need some linear algebra because I'm making it with vectors and matrices. So I need to be careful about where I'm putting the transpose. And the result will look like this, which is the pseudo inverse. And we will see this pseudo inverse also everywhere in the context of movement primitives. So in robotics, we are used to pseudo inverse when we are doing inverse kinematic control. In the case of movement primitives, we will also use pseudo inverse very frequently.
Excuse me. So you say the function is y equals xa, and it's a bit strange, no? Usually it should be ax.
Oh, yeah, there are several ways, and you can also define least square problem. Least square is really like, it can be used in many different ways. So in some problems you prefer to have ax.
But should I think of x as a vector or not necessarily?
A here as a matrix.
But x?
X, everything is matrix here,
okay,
but x is like a data point being a vector organized in a matrix form. So here it's like having each column being one.
Statisticians usually like x times a.
Yeah,
because everything derivation will go through.
Thank you.
But the remark is correct. Like you can find actually different ways of describing it. So it's why I'm also taking some time, because very often what happens is we all think it's fine, least square, okay, we have this problem with like a bunch of points and we want to find the best line fitting this point. But when we think of it with higher dimension, we need to be really sure that we are talking about the same thing here.
So the choice you did to put the input as a matrix form and not in a vector, like every sample putting the DI in a stack of vectors, is a computational reason or just a flavor?
It's for computational reason, but it's also because after you can start building on that. In a more, you can make more connections with other techniques.
Okay.
Because after, when you have everything organized as a matrix, you can make something after more complicated than this. And if you would keep everything as a weighted sum with vectors, it might become a problem. So in this lecture, at least, I'm using a lot of linear algebra, meaning that I will each time try to format the problem in matrix form, while it's not obligatory to solve the problem in a matrix form. Also with MPC I will do the same later on. So I will also use quite a lot of linear algebra by reorganizing my, my vector on matrices, by stacking my different elements, and try to use as much as possible a matrix form for the problem. You will see that later.
And I think also the having the n data points in this X vector, that's kind of compulsory, because otherwise your A isn't the least square solution to using all of your data, right? So you always stack such that you can have a least square solution.
Yeah, but you could make the objective with sum, and then you would need to take into account that you have this sum.
Yeah.
When you make it in matrix form, the sum disappears. So it's just that you have something where there is no sum, and it's
I think
handy
the point is that if you take y and x as a stack vectors,
Yeah.
then A is much bigger.
Yeah.
And then each part of A is acting on each vector differently, unless you repeat A, the same A several times.
Yeah.
In this way, the action of A over each column or each line of X is the same.
Okay.
And so each point on X is transformed the same way into each point of Y. And if you stack everything, you can have different transformations for each one of them.
Because
A
A doesn't
is-
change.
Hmm?
A is the same.
It's
That's
smaller,
the thing.
and it has the same action on every line. Which is
I
not-
understand now.
the other problem would be much more complex, I think.
Or maybe to come back to the computational aspect, when you do it in this form, what happens is you can use a lot your computer power without having to think too much about it. Like if you have a good linear algebra library, very often what will happen is you will really use all of the computational power of your machine or your cluster to do this. So formatting it in a matrix form also has this advantage. Typically, you will have GPU being used without you knowing that GPU are used for this problem. But if you depending on the linear algebra library you use, it will by default exploit your computer capability to do this problem. So it's also one other useful point to have things written in matrix form. So, okay, so maybe when you think of least squares, it's often this kind of problem we have in mind, with points on a graph, with x the input, y the output, and we would like to find a line that will minimize these distances from the point to the line. So this is the most obvious least square problem that we can think of. Here in this slide, what I want to show you is that the input and output can be quite rich in structures. Here, if you think of the input, if I have some x, these are all linear regression problems where I have only changed the structure of my problem by defining a new x, capital X, by being some input where I can put x squared, I can put any actually function of x, and I can start building a dictionary like this by having some input being function of x, and then the output being what I'm looking for as a curve fitting problem. So if I'm putting x being 1, it means I want to find the constant value, like a flat line, that will minimize these error terms in black. If I'm putting x as x and y, I want to find the best slope and the best offset that will fit my data point. And then here you have different flavor of polynomial fitting. So polynomial fitting will find the best value to put in front of x squared, x and y, 1, to have a function of degree 2 representing my data as best as possible. So what we need to recall here is that we can get here nonlinear behavior, but the relationship between these polynomials and the output remains linear. So it's a linear problem, but we can create quite a lot of complex fitting characteristics here. It's also the reason why least squares appear at many different places, because if you put structures in x and y, very often least squares will be enough to solve the problem if you have a lot of structure. So now for locally weighted regression, I need to consider the weighted version of least squares. So it's very similar to what we have seen with least squares, but now we will add some weight that can give importance to data points in my data set. So again, here I will write it with linear algebra. So this time, when it's weighted by W, I will have this quadratic cost function with a W appearing here. W is a precision matrix. And if I'm differentiating with respect to A and equating to 0, I get this weighted pseudo-inverse form that will also appear everywhere in this lecture. So maybe let me show you with this example what it means. So here, a standard least square problem will find a line where all of the data points will contribute in an equivalent manner to determine where to put this line. So what would be this slope to minimize these error terms in black. Now if I'm deciding that the first point are much more important than the other, maybe they are more accurate. If I'm defining a weight where the weight is high for the first points and low for the last points, then weighted least squares will give me this kind of fit. So instead of having a line with this slope, it will tilt the line differently by taking into account the weight that we gave to the different points. And this will be a key to develop the locally weighted regression problem. So the locally weighted regression problem will do like that. It will create some weighting functions that will tell you that we want to do a linear regression problem only on some specific points on our trajectory. So here if we give these weights here, it means that I will consider only the first 1/4 of the trajectory, and that I will compute a line fitting this part of the data, that I will create a weighted least square problem by putting a lot of weight on this part of the point. And now if I'm doing a second weighted least square problem, but this time I'm giving as weight these weights, then I will find the best slope here that will represent this part of the data. So if I'm doing 4 different weighted least square problems, I will have this representation of my movement, where locally I have some linear relationship, and globally I have some non-linear behavior being constructed. So here that's the way it's defined a bit more formally. So LWR will compute K estimates A of this matrix A, each by using a different weighting function, and we will call phi k the weighting functions. And in the case of locally weighted regression, we are usually using radial basis functions. So some functions of this exponential form. It's not exactly a Gaussian, because a Gaussian would have some normalizing term in front of it. It's more about the core of the Gaussian. So it's really taking this exponential shape that is of interest for our problem. It's not obligatory, but very often we like to rescale these basis functions so that they sum to 1. If I'm, for each time step here, if I'm summing over k the value of these different basis functions, I will get 1. So this operation is very common with locally weighted regression, but it's not obligatory in many cases. So now if we look at the parameters of these radial basis functions, so first we need to decide how many radial basis functions we have. Then we need to decide where to place them along the trajectory. So most of the time, what we do is to just say that it's a uniform distribution of this basis function. So we just take basis functions so that they are equally spreading the whole trajectory. And then we also need to define what is the bandwidth of each of these basis functions. If you think of it as a Gaussian, it means we need to find the variance of the basis functions. So most of the time, we take the variance being the same for all basis functions. Meaning that here, I will have for this basis function, for this one, for this one, for this one, the same sigma k here. It's not obligatory, it's a choice. And it's the choice being used most of the time when we are using locally weighted regression. Yes, please.
So now we move to radial basis functions, but we could have used polynomials as before.
That's exactly
the choice.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I'm emphasizing. And it's why I'm trying to make these connections. It's to show that you can use a lot from one specific technique. And if you think of it as what is the underlying mechanism, then after you can combine it much more easily with other mechanisms. And sometimes you also realize that some choice were maybe not the best for the problem we need to solve. So yeah, so it's exactly what I wanted you to notice actually when we are using this kind of technique to include. So yeah, so as a summary, we have k-weighted regression problem on the same data set. So we will use the same data set for the input and the output. And maybe a second key point is that we are solving a nonlinear problem by viewing it as a sum of local problems. So we will do several times linear regression, and globally we will have a nonlinear mapping between the two.
Just a remark. Can you go back one slide? So finally you have n linear piecewise approximations of this, but it's not continuous. So what happens with your result? So what are you planning to do with it?
So it's continuous because of this transition here. If we would have, instead of having a radial basis functions, if we would have taken a weight matrix being sharp, being like really saying we have 1 for all of this segment and 0 elsewhere.
So the solution is the red line going through all the...
So if we would have the sharp one, we would get as a solution the colored stepwise path. Okay. So here we would have jump. But if we take radial basis function, it means that when we are in between the two, we have weight. Here it means we have weight 0.5 for this one and 0.5 for this one.
All right.
And the smoothness of the red curve is because we have this smoothness here with the change of the weights. And it's also why radial basis functions were have been used, like the property of this radial basis function, the most interesting property is this kind of smoothness between when you transit from one to the other. But this smoothness, if you would replace that with Bernstein polynomials, you would also have it. So something, let's say, that we know is we need something smooth, very likely, at least for this kind of problem. So when we represent trajectories, we most likely need something smooth. If it's a different kind of problem, sometimes we don't necessarily need to have this average. In some problem, we are fine if it's a sharp boundary.
So to fit this least squares, it's a non-convex problem, right? Because you have the covariance times the means.
So you can solve it analytically. So when you put it like that, you have an analytical solution. So each time you compute one of these slope here, it's not something where you need iteration. It's an analytic solution.
You mean optimizing simultaneously with the mean and variance?
Yes. So here, if you fix the weight, and if the problem is to learn A.
I see. So you alternate. Okay.
So what they suggest with locally weighted regression is to set the weight.
Yeah.
So they
diagonal, being diagonal.
But I guess your question is related to the fact if you want to estimate both the weight and
typically use EM algorithm or something.
Yeah,
which is
and we will see it's actually Gaussian mixture regression that we will see next. So it makes a perfect transition between with what we will see. Other questions? So here it's to say it again. So with locally weighted regression, often we are setting the centroid to be uniformly covering the input space, and we are keeping the same variance for all the basis functions. Maybe if you have multi-dimensional input, what it means is that we have a covariance matrix being diagonal, being isotropic. So if you think of it with the input being multidimensional, you are also fixing the structure of the covariance matrix. Again, it's not obligatory, but it's the way it's being used when you do locally weighted regression. So this is here the way we organize the weight, as I was saying, in the form of a matrix. So here I was displaying this phi function in this weight, and in the problem we will have this weight appearing in a matrix form. It will be a diagonal matrix where I have, for each time step, I will have this weight appearing in the diagonal. And if I'm setting this weight, and I'm using this weight to evaluate A, then I can rebuild my movement with this weighted sum. So here it's again, when I'm doing that in matrix form, I can put a weight as a diagonal matrix. So I have my xi, and then the linear matrix that I have estimated. Okay, so to encode trajectories, we will use as the input, we will use time steps. We will just have some series of time steps. So it can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until the number of time steps that you have. The weight will have this shape. And this is what we get when we use a different form of input. So if we now use more complex form of input, being polynomial functions. So here if I'm thinking of this time input, not only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, but also adding the square version of it. It means that I have a more structured input matrices. If I want some line with offset, as I presented before, I will need this kind of input. And if I want only lines being constant value for each part of the movement, I can put just one as the input. So here again, it's a choice. Most of the time with locally weighted regression, this is the one being done. But I would argue that it's not obligatory, that we can use different forms of input depending on what we want to do. So here, as you can see in this problem, what happens is that the more order I add to this polynomial, the better fit I would get. Which is expected, because here it means that locally, instead of fitting a line, it will fit here the equation of degree 2. It will try to fit something of the form x squared plus x plus some constant. And here I have a better way of approximating my curve if I'm using some higher order polynomials.
So what's the bottom right?
What's the?
So you expand the x and then you have an RBF on top of that.
Yes.
Is that what you do? Okay. So then what's the graph on the bottom? If it's three-dimensional.
Yes.
So that's like
The
the
input
projection of
would be three-dimensional for my x here. On the output here it would be two-dimensional because it's this, this curve that I'm representing. So here I'm showing only the first dimension. But so here I have a problem being 3D input to the output. Here 2D input to the output, and here 1D input to the output.
But I think possibly the confusion was, I think the input x is still whatever dimensionality x is, but you augment it to be a 3D input, so you create these 3 dimensions.
So here it's 3D when my small x is 1D.
Yeah.
But then after you can also...
Yes.
I don't know, I don't think small x...
Yeah, it's
in this
here
case
it's
is
time. I keep x because what happens is I want to use after linear regression in very different ways. So I stick to the notation where y is output, x is input. And in some of the cases, like locally weighted regression, this x will be time based.
So in the graphing, instead of t, we can just put small x
Yes.
in the horizontal axis.
So yeah, that's so it's what I was mentioning at the beginning. So for a very specific problem, I would prefer, instead of calling y the output, I would prefer to call it x if it would be a robotics problem. On the input, I would prefer to call it t. But if I'm doing that, it means I will need to rewrite all of the weighted least squares equation. Maybe it would be after harder to make connections between other techniques. So here typically, like it's why I have adopted this notation. So, okay, so we have here now different ways of approximating this movement with a weighted sum of polynomials. So now, often what happens in practice is that depending on what we select as polynomials, after we will also select the number of basis functions accordingly. Here I've tried to fit this letter G as best as I could, trying to find, like intuitively, what is the best trade-off between the number of parameters I'm using in the model versus the fit of my function. And here I've tried to do this exercise with different input, different polynomials input. So here in this case, I had to use many basis functions in order to have a good fit. If I'm using some input that is a bit more structured, then I could decrease a bit the number of basis functions I would use. And if I'm taking a polynomial of degree 2, here I could use only 3 basis functions and I would have a fit that would be similar to the other examples.
And what are the gray shapes that you outline there, like in a second?
So the gray would be it's my demonstration, so it's what I would like my system to reproduce.
But you have many grades.
Yes, so here we have 5 demonstrations,
Ah,
and we would like to find the curve that fit best these 5 demonstrations.
okay.
It's, I could have drawn only one, but in many problems we will have actually several demonstrations, and we want to find some. It's like finding the average, some average trajectory that would best fit the data. But the problem works here if you have only one demonstration. But with one demonstration, so usually you don't care about every movement primitive. If you have really one demonstration, maybe you can directly use this demonstration. Most of the time, what will be more interesting is to get the essential aspect of multiple demonstrations. Here in this case, they all look more or less the same, but if it's a more complex problem, we will have variations at some places that are higher than at some others. If it's, if you think of it with dynamics, maybe there will be like variations in dynamics, but not in kinematic. So, so it will be important to also encapsulate these variations by using these movement primitives. So
But where are these different demonstrations in your formula? Because up to now, I saw you have one set of data and you want to kind of interpolate it somehow. But now you say you have n sets of data.
they appear here. So when you estimate this A matrix, here you are using your training data. So your XO here would be your multiple demonstrations.
Okay.
And when you get this estimate,
All right.
after
yes.
you reuse some input on here, this is like the average. I should have called it X hat actually to show that this is when you estimate A, and then here this is when you want to generate the average behavior. I will give the slide. So after I will add the hat here.
So basically, it's the Y at the beginning. No?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So compared to the demonstrations of the G, your curves, they always cut it pretty much short, right? And I mean, this looks like you do like a linear interpolation where you just cut the shortest path, but you're doing more like least squares where you would think it would be in the middle. Why is it not?
So you mean short in the sense that we can see that it's tending to shrink the,
Yes.
it's the smoothing effect of these kind of techniques. Like the so you know, with this overlap, what happens is here it's making the average between the two. And if you have this being, depending on the parameter you set for the variance, you can have either a big overlap or nearly no overlap. And you can, depending on how you set this, you have either something being really sharp or something being very, very, very fuzzy. And when it's very fuzzy, it's very smooth, but it tends to make this smoothing effect that can be a problem in some applications. So here your remark is correct that it will tend to, the smoothing effect will tend to make your shape out of the demonstrations, depending on the factor you set as this bandwidth here. So here one way to make it closer to the curve would be to take the variance, shrink it. It will get closer to the curve, but it will also make something where you would have some sharper transition between each of the basis functions. So it will like make a lot of small linear, lot of small lines building your G trajectory. So the remark is important because it's also related to the choice of the basis functions. Like here we take Gaussians because we want something smooth, but the side effect is that we will also have negative aspect when smoothing the curve.
The time axis, is it the actual timing of the demonstration, or is it like the linear relying axis? Or because if you're doing several demonstrations, the gray lines won't show how much time you spent in each portion. But I guess that at a specific time, you may have points that are higher or lower in the curve, and when you average them out, they are going to be inside the demonstrations.
Yeah, so here in this slide I will not talk about that, but you're right. If we collect multiple demonstrations, we need some way to pre-process the data with this kind of techniques to align them. So the most simple way would be to say, like you take the longer one, for example, and you match all of the other demonstrations to be of the same size. So that would be like some linear rescaling of your data set to have all of your data having the same length. It can still create distortion because when you record a movement being a quite long movement, what will happen is that you might be slower at the beginning, faster at the end, and vice versa. And if you do this kind of homogeneous rescaling, you won't solve the problem because you will have some of the demonstration being late sometimes, and others being faster. And when you look at the variation spatially, it looks like there are variations, but it's just variations because in terms of the duration, it was so there are pre-processing techniques to do that. So typically when using locally weighted regression, people like to use dynamic time warping first. Dynamic time warping would be a way to rescale non-homogeneously your timeline to have this matching appearing. You will see later that I will present techniques where we don't need that anymore. So it's also why maybe I didn't emphasize so much on this pre-processing, but it's a valid remark, and it's an important one in practice, especially if you include long movement. Like the longer the movement is, the most likely it is that you will need some important pre-processing algorithm to solve the problem. It can be rescaling, it can also be like the time you start recording your movement, and the time you stop, very likely there will be some misalignment also, just in terms of the recording. So even if you are really providing demonstrations with a good timing, even if you don't record at the same time the movement, you might get this problem. Okay, other questions? So maybe some resources if you want to test that on your own. So we are developing this library called PBDLib for programming by demonstration, which is a set of examples, mostly in MATLAB or in C++. The MATLAB version is compatible with GNU Octave, so it's also something that can be run even if you don't have MATLAB. So we make sure that this is compatible with the open source version Octave. So most of the examples will be in this MATLAB repository. Most of the things I will show today are also in C++, and a few of those are also in Python. But it's the ordering. Like we have a lot of things in MATLAB, a bit fewer in C++, and a bit fewer in Python. For the references, so locally weighted regression is something very old. So maybe Cleveland would be one of the references for the history of locally weighted regression. It's Chris Atkinson, the first who brought it to robotics, together with Stefan Schall. And it's a tool being used also nowadays. So it's really a tool that is important for robotics and for control in general because of these, I would say, simple mechanisms behind, and because it can be used together with other techniques quite efficiently. Now I will move to a variant of it called Gaussian mixture regression, which is using more or less the same mechanism that is trying to learn where to place these different basis functions, and also to try to estimate the parameters of these basis functions. So it's tool relying on a mixture of Gaussians that is allowing us to do that. So a mixture of Gaussians, it will be a weighted sum of Gaussians, where each Gaussian will be parameterized by center mu and covariance matrix sigma. So here the idea will be to represent in a probabilistic manner all different trajectories by taking both input and output. So we are learning the joint distribution of the input and output in this case. The way I will represent this mixture of Gaussians is to trace only the equidensity contour. So I will draw ellipses, but you need to take into account that each time I'm drawing an ellipse, it's not that you are inside the ellipse or outside, it's a full continuous distribution, and here I'm plotting only one contour of it. So observations, I will most of the time call it X, but sometimes I will use Xi for the observations. So I was mentioning the center of the Gaussian, the covariance matrix, and there is this mixing coefficient, which is the weight here. So how much each Gaussian is important to represent our data. So this will be the parameters, pi, mu, and sigma. Now for sigma, we have different choices of structures. So if I would like to fit to locally weighted regression problem, I would typically use this kind of structure, like isotropic structure for the covariance. Meaning that I would have a diagonal covariance where each term is the same, each element of the diagonal is the same. And if I want to make something with a bit more flexibility, I could go one step next and say that each of these terms can have a different value. So that would be like a diagonal covariance. Here this is what it means as a representation. It means that I can have my ellipse will be aligned with the x1 and x2 axes, but here I can have different spread in one axis or the other with this kind of structure. Then I can also use full covariance matrices. So here it means I can estimate all of the elements in my matrix as long as this is symmetric positive definite. So here in this case, if we think of it as ellipses, it means that I can now tilt my ellipses to fit my data set. So here what you need to remember is that the more structure we add, the more parameters we will need to estimate. So we need to be careful that the number of data points that we have in our data set is also in proportion to what we want to estimate as the structure of our model. So in this case, full covariance matrices are looking very good for movement because it means that it can encode coordination between different variables. So it looked like something useful, but it also means that here if you add a lot of dimension, it also means I need to estimate a lot of parameters. So if you think of a humanoid robot, and let's say we want to encode joint angle trajectories, and let's say that we have 20 dimensions, it means here that each of the Gaussian will have a covariance being 20 by 20, which is quite a lot. So what we usually prefer to do is to have some tying of the parameters, meaning that we can reuse some of the parameters of one Gaussian in another Gaussian. What it means here is that we will need to estimate a smaller number of parameters. And in terms of movement representation, what it means is that we can use the same coordination pattern in one part of a movement and in another part of the movement. So it's something where you have several parts of the movement trying to agree about what are the most important coordination patterns. Which is something in movement that makes sense because very often we will use the same set of coordination patterns when we are doing the task. Here the most simple example will be to say that if I have my humanoid grasping an object and pulling it back, here I might not need to have a full covariance matrix to describe the movement of my arm, maybe only a few directions, eigendirections are relevant to encode my movement. So here it means that my full covariance matrix maybe doesn't need to be of rank 20. It can be maybe something where I can represent that with only a few elements showing me the most essential coordination pattern that I need to reach my object and pull it back. The same for walking data. I might not need to have this 20 by 20 covariance matrix to represent my movement, the local shape of my movement, but I can very likely have a much smaller dimension.
This sigmas is something you design. It's not something you want to get from the system. You just depose these numbers before.
So I would say yes and no. So very often they are pre-specified. So it's the structure being pre-specified. But some work also have tried to learn it. So here, learning it means you usually take this generic one, but then you try to estimate the number of eigencomponents you need to build your covariance. So here you allow your system to be rank 20 if you have a 20 by 20 covariance, but you let the system discover that maybe 20 is way too high as a rank, and that maybe a covariance of rank 2 with only 2 directions is maybe enough to represent your movement.
So is that like maximum likelihood something? Because if you fit this, you can get the likelihood of the data.
So there are several ways. I'm not sure I'm covering it in the... No, I'm partially covering it later, but one simple way would be to try with different covariances, with different ranks, and then having a score looking at the number of parameters you needed to put in the system to encode that, versus how much you could fit your data, how well you could fit your data.
So how much you fit your data will be the likelihood?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Right, so that's good.
And then you decide about the model that looks the most adapted to it, so as a trade-off between number of parameters versus your likelihood. So it's one way. There are other ways where you estimate it while you estimate the parameters of your system. So you try to fit your Gaussian, but you also try to fit how many components you need. Yeah, we can maybe discuss later about that, but there are like Bayesian techniques that can allow you to do this.
Why don't you map the covariances from the task space, this lower dimension, to the zone space, and have only the directions?
So let's say that in this lecture we would have something either in task space or in joint space. We can do also with both, but I will not cover that. Something maybe we can discuss, but here I'm not talking about the mapping between joint space and task space. So it will be like we select one, we say, okay, we have a movement that we will represent in joint space for some examples, and the movement we will represent in task space for other examples. Okay, so yeah, so now how to learn that? So here I didn't mention yet how to find where to put these centers mu, where to place these covariance matrices sigma, and how to estimate these mixing coefficient pi. So the history of GMM is quite interesting because the model itself has been here for forever. Like the encoding of data as a mixture of Gaussians is used from at least from this date. What is interesting is the estimation of the parameters has always changed. So with each new technology, you have a new way of estimating these parameters of this Gaussian mixture model. So if we start from very old time, what happened is there was no computer to compute the solution. So the problem was formatted in a way that was working well with the current tools available at this time. And the first maybe problem that is being described in the literature was about finding the parameters of these two Gaussians, so a mixture of two Gaussians, and we wanted to find parameters that would fit this histogram. This histogram was some population of crabs in Naples, and they realized that if they were picking a distribution being just a Gaussian, that was not quite right. Like it was, the real data was a bit skewed to one side. And the problem here was to see if we could represent that as a mixture of two Gaussians. And the underlying idea was that they were thinking that there were actually two populations of crabs, so two different kinds of crabs, and that here they were actually recording some population that was a mixture of two populations. And with this very old paper, they could show that actually the mixture of two Gaussians was a very good fit to the data that they collected, and that it could create this distribution in red that is skewed and that is representing well what they collected. So what is interesting is they did that with this very specific case, which was not general, it was two Gaussians, one dimension. It's a very long paper, 54 pages. The solution is a bit crazy, like it's something where they need to solve a polynomial of degree 9. They do it by hand with graphs, so it's kind of interesting. So it's a moment-based approach. And what is even more interesting is that people are coming back to this kind of techniques nowadays, quite differently, but they have connection with spectral decomposition techniques, and it's actually something that you can find papers at ICML on NIPS showing that actually it's maybe a good research direction to take, and that there are more elaborated algorithms that are based on moment matching techniques that could solve this problem of estimating the parameters of a mixture of Gaussians. But apart from this work, what is nowadays very popular to estimate the parameters of a mixture of Gaussians is the expectation maximization algorithm. This is used in, I would say, 95% of the cases. It has been extremely widespread with the use of computers because it's an algorithm that is really easy to use with computers. It consists of two steps. There is a first step, the estimation step, looking at how much each Gaussian is representing each data point. So it's giving a score for each data point of how likely it is that it belongs to one Gaussian or the other. And then when we know that, in the maximization step, we will readjust this Gaussian by centering it toward the point that we're thinking they belong to these Gaussians. Here it's like also again a weighted fitting problem where we are using this as a weight, and then we update the mixing coefficient, the center, and the covariance by using these weights to recenter these Gaussians in proportion to their belongings to these Gaussians. So it's a bit like counting. We are counting, and then we are making a weighted average to take into account the responsibility of each data point in each cluster. It's something that is usually nice to visualize graphically. Very often the convergence is super fast. So it means that if I have a low dimensional problem, I need to start with something crazy in order to show you what it does. If I would start with something we are usually using in practice, the convergence would be so fast that it would not be really didactic. But if I'm starting with a mess like this, with all of these Gaussians being my initial estimate, and here the mixing coefficient being that, the expectation step here will first compute how likely it is to belong to these different Gaussians, and I will assign a color to the data point that is in proportion to this assignment. So here it means that all of these data points here are closer to these Gaussians, so they will be in yellow. These ones here are closer to this red Gaussian, so they will be in red. So this is the expectation step. I'm computing these weights. And then in the M step, I'm updating the parameters of the Gaussians in order to better fit the data point of the corresponding colors. I'm doing the same here for the mixing coefficients. Then I'm running the E step again. the color are changing here when I'm recentering the data point. And here I took an example where it's taking some steps, but usually it's very fast. But even here, even if I'm starting with this mess, it's still converging to a solution here where I have the different Gaussians encoding different parts of the method. In practice, when we use expectation maximization, we are finding a local optimum. So it means that it's likely smart to start from different initial estimate at the beginning, and then use a solution that has the best likelihood. What else? And then there are different ways of regularizing the problem. So we can also set some regularization parameter that makes the system more simple to be estimated. So if you think of it as a solution space being very chaotic, and if you know that this is only providing a local solution, a local estimate, then there are ways to make this this function, this solution space being smoother, and then having more chance to converge to a set of parameters that make sense for your problem. It's
In this case, P1 is the average of that function plus the parameters of the covariance that is fixed now. Like
yeah, P1 is some weight, it's just telling you how important is the Gaussian in general.
Ah, okay, okay.
Very often with our problem, what happens is it will tend to converge to something where all Gaussians has equal weight. It means that they have been used in a smart way. You can actually visualize like this. Imagine if now it has found one Gaussian being somewhere else, being completely useless. It would have a weight being very small, but it means that the three other Gaussians will need to encode the data, meaning that here the likelihood for each of these Gaussians would be lower, because if you try to represent that with only 3 Gaussians, there would be one missing. So sometimes these pi here are also representing how likely, how well the system converges to a solution for your problem. If here you see some very big heterogeneity, it might be a sign that maybe you should run the EM algorithm again. Also maybe in many algorithms this is actually dropped. So there are many mixture of Gaussians that are forgetting about these ones and just saying they are equal mixing coefficients summing to 1, and just discarding the estimation of this pi. So I would say for movement primitives, this is not very important. The covariance is really hugely important because it's what is representing the coordination pattern. The centers are maybe even less important than the covariance. So it's something to take into account because there are many work or domain of applications where you don't care about the covariance. So there are many domains where you have isotropic Gaussians. But I would argue that for movement we need full covariances to represent the coordination pattern.
So what would be a good way to know that you finished your iterations? It's like
yeah, good point.
A measure to know that you converge to something.
So here it's converging locally to some solution. So one way to know when to stop is to see if between 2 consecutive steps if the likelihood changed. And if it didn't, it's because you converge to some local optimum. So you can either have something dynamic that is checking if you have an improvement. In practice, people are also running it for a given number of iterations. Since it's an algorithm being very fast, sometimes it's not a bottleneck to just say, okay, run it 100 times, maybe it's overestimated.
So in this case, you have a data set of trajectories, and you want to cluster them like Gaussian. Each trajectory is a multivariate Gaussian. That's what you're doing. Is that more like it? So you have a bunch of Gaussians, and you want to cluster a data set of trajectories, and each trajectory you assume that it comes from a Gaussian picture model. Or is it breaking with a single trajectory?
here it's a bunch of trajectories. So here it would be 3 demonstrations.
So are those then from the same, for the same?
The same, yeah, like the same task, yeah. It depends on your problem. In this case, I'm assuming it's the same task, so I'm assuming I will have to reuse all of these demonstrations as a block. But you can use mixture of Gaussians for other problems where you would use this actually to segment different types of, to classify different types of trajectories. So it really depends on the problem. Here in this lecture I'm covering the most simple case, but you could have, like here you could have another movement, and you could run the algorithm and have some of the Gaussians being used to include one of the movement, and the other Gaussians being used to include another movement. So depending on the problem.
But it's a single problem, single task.
Yeah, you have a single task problem.
So you don't estimate your covariances in time, because back, if you went back to the slides, it's basically that you...
So here in this example, no, but in the next slide, yes. So in the next slide, I will use it also to cluster time, and this will be what makes the link between locally weighted regression and Gaussian mixture regression.
Because back in the first slide, you have only just portions of Gaussian covariances. So if you
mean in this one?
For your trajectory, yeah.
The one before.
So yeah, this one. So basically, you don't compute your covariances in terms of for the whole trajectories in time.
This one
not in this example.
You just give the structure, but you don't give the value. The value you estimate from the demonstration. So you give the structure to be diagonal, but the value itself you find from the demonstration. It's still complete.
Okay.
So if it's x1 and x2, each data point for me is a vector data point, 2 dimension with x1 and x2.
Okay, so here only the structure of the Gaussian, but estimating it for the whole trajectory in time.
There's no time here.
Yeah, there's no time here. It's like so it also means that I could reshuffle my data point in any way I want, and the problem would stay the same. So here, you know, like instead of organizing this data point as x1, x2, x3, x4, these time steps, if I would reshuffle that, for this example, it will not matter. So here it's encoding, in this case, only spatial information. But what I will show next is that you can use the same mechanism with data that is time, x1, x2. So time step, x1, x2. And here it would learn a mixture of Gaussians, where each Gaussian has 3 dimensions, and one of these dimensions will be related to time.
Okay.
And it's exactly the next part. I guess now it's maybe a good time to take a break, and then we will come back to this after the break.